Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Elif Shafak?
Hi, hello, hi.
Hello, Elif. It's such a pleasure to have you on this call. Thank you so much for being part of these quarantine tapes. Where do I find you at the present time?
I am in London. That's where you find me, in a lockdown London.
And what are you doing during this lockdown? How are you spending your quarantine days?
You know, it's I think I have two opposite energies, if I may put it this way, because as a novelist, my job, my work is based on solitude. So there's a part of me that is very much inward looking in that regard. And then there's another part of me as a public speaker, as an author who loves to do events, public events, which is more outward looking.
Right.
So I've always tried to balance that. And of course, with the pandemic, both sides have been affected deeply in the sense that it's not easy to focus and write. And we are not able to go and do literary events or public talks and meet with readers. So in many ways, I think, like all of us, my daily life has changed tremendously.
I know that you and I share quite a few passions, and probably we will be speaking about some of these passions during our call. But let me start with one, which is Miloš. And Miloš, in the separate notebooks, wrote the following: "The bright side of the planet moves towards darkness, and the cities are falling asleep, each in its hour. And for me, now as then, it is too much. There is too much world." I wonder how that resonates with you. There is too much world.
It does. It does resonate very deeply. And also, maybe because I come from a broken land, from a wounded democracy. And people like me who have come from places like Turkey, Pakistan, Brazil, Venezuela, but also Hungary, to a certain extent, Poland, and the list is getting longer and longer, unfortunately.
Yes.
We have maybe seen that things change very fast and history does not always necessarily go forward, that tomorrow is not necessarily more developed, secure than yesterday, and actually sometimes time can go backwards and countries can slide into ultranationalism, authoritarianism, this uncertainty that comes with populism also. So when you also go through those things, you do accumulate a different type of woe and maybe melancholy. And that's, I think, very much relevant to, in a way, what we are experiencing right now, because there's this feeling that nothing feels solid anymore, nothing feels certain anymore. The very ground under our feet feels very liquid in this age.
A Wounded Land made me think about your interest in wounded words and the way in which you learned. I mean, at one moment, I should mention this because I so love it. You're using forgotten Ottoman words. You said, "I used to sleep with an Ottoman dictionary in my bed."
That's true.
It's tell me about that, and tell me about wounded words and trying, in a sense, to reclaim them, because without them, perhaps so much is lost. And as you said, so much is already lost.
Yeah. Actually, there's a metaphor that Walter Benjamin uses, and I've always loved it. And I find it visually very powerful too. Sometimes he says, when you are interested in culture, language, literature, it's a bit like walking on a pile of rubble, you know? Something terrible has happened, like an earthquake, a destruction, a disruption. And then you're walking on this pile of rubble, trying to hear if there are any signs or sounds of life under the rubble. And if you hear anything, a sign of life, you try to pull it up and bring it to the surface. And maybe that's the work of an author as well. You know, when you love words that have been erased, purged, deleted, it's a bit like walking on a pile of rubble. But also, I think I feel this way because, again, coming from a country like Turkey, I think I care about memory. Turkey is a country with a very rich history, but that doesn't mean we have a solid memory of history. In fact, it's the opposite. I think it's a society of collective amnesia. So there's a huge void, you know. People genuinely don't know much about their own, even their own family history, let alone, you know, the country's history, including its darkest chapters. And it becomes very difficult to talk about those chapters. So I think in that regard as well, when you are interested in the stories of people who have been silenced, pushed to the periphery, erased in a way, not only words, but also people and their stories, then again, it's a bit like walking on a pile of rubble.
Again, Elif, when you mention the word periphery, I think of another interest I believe we share, which is an interest in the work of Carlo Ginzburg and his interest in microhistory. And what can microhistory reveal that history doesn't? You know, Carlo, for me, is tremendously important, the way he approaches research. I don't know if you know this line. He says that when he approaches a subject, he approaches it with a euphoria of ignorance.
I love that. I have always loved Carlo Ginzburg's work, and the whole endeavor to bring out microhistories to the center is incredibly important, especially if you care about minorities, you know, people whose stories have been most often deliberately erased, but also forgotten out of ignorance. If you care about those histories, multiple, plural, diverse, I think microhistory is incredibly important. So as a novelist, his work left a big impact on me, because when you read his work, you know, he cares and he gives voice in a way to so-called ordinary people. Nobody's ordinary, but from the point of view of official historiography, you know, these ordinary people's stories do not matter. In Turkey, when I go to school, when I swallow nationalist history, there are no individuals in that story. You know, the very few individuals that exist in an official history book are either the Sultan or the Sheikh al-Islam, right, the head of the ulema, the religious hierarchy, and that's about it. There are no women in that history. There are no minorities in that official history. So I think it becomes very important to say, wait a minute, how would I feel? You know, you talk about the age of glory and conquest and all of that. How would I feel had I been an Armenian silversmith living in 17th century, 16th century Ottoman Empire? How would I feel had I been a Jewish miller or a concubine in the harem, you know, or a sex slave in the sex market, slavery market? You know, so when you ask these seemingly small questions about real human beings, you realize the story changes so much depending who's telling it. And I think that is very important for writers and intellectuals and academics. We should never forget that there isn't just one single absolute truth. We should always keep questioning it and try to shift our cognitive angle a little bit and never to lose sight of empathy.
I love the fact that you said seemingly small.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's not small. Maybe it seems to be small, but it is not. And I think this is how we challenge the official narrative. When you put all these pieces together and you realize all those individuals whose voices are not reflected in the official narrative, they are part of history. And I think it is a responsibility to remember what they have gone through, to remember the voids, the vacuums in official narratives, and try to show that actually the same story can be told in multiple ways. I love that cognitive flexibility, but I believe only literature, maybe not only, but literature does it so well. Because when you read someone's story, that's how we feel. That's how we emotionally connect. And I'm someone who does believe in the power of emotions. I never belittle emotions. And I think it's very important to think more carefully about emotional intelligence.
What stories do you feel do the job well? And what stories do the job well now? I mean, what stories can we read now that might help? And I'm thinking about this in particular, and sorry for asking so many questions all at once, but I just can't keep myself. I know we also share love of Doris Lessing, and she said literature is analysis after the event, to which you said, might it be a time when literature becomes analysis during the event? And during this moment, what kind of analysis can we offer, and what kind of reading can we do, not really to offer us consolation, but perhaps a better cognitive understanding of the present moment?
It's a question I ask myself. Had Doris Lessing been alive today, maybe she would have, now, especially at this moment in time. And I completely understand and agree with what she's saying. For literature to analyze the moment, you need some time to pass, to digest, swallow. I fully understand that. But on the other hand, there are moments in history when you have to, as an individual, as a writer, you feel the urgency, almost like an emergency, to speak up. And again, maybe writers coming from wounded democracies, maybe we've experienced this earlier, in the sense that when so much is happening outside the window, you can't say, okay, I don't want to talk about what's going on the street. I just want to talk about my book. Of course we want to talk about our books, but what is happening outside the window does affect us. And I think we have a responsibility to speak up about it. So, and also I have to add, I'm a feminist. And one of the many wonderful things that I've learned from feminist movements of past generations in particular was that politics is not only about the parliament, political parties. There's politics everywhere, including the personal is political. So again, if you describe politics in such a broad way, I don't think writers can be apolitical or non-political. I'm not talking about being partisan, or I'm not even talking about party politics, but I'm talking about speaking up about fundamental issues such as rule of law, freedom of speech, human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. These core issues. I don't think we can be silent about these. And maybe more and more authors across the world have begun to feel that sense of urgency.
Who do you turn to for an understanding of the present moment? And by that I mean, quite frankly, not only writers who are writing now. I know you've said that books change us, books save us, and you say, I know this because it happened to me. So when it happens, and when it happens at the present time, who do you turn to for that kind of insight, as it were?
I do turn to books all the time, and I sincerely, honestly think the act of reading, the process of reading should be continuous, It's books are companions. So it's not just it's something you do now and then, but they should have a constant presence in our lives. But that said, I do believe equally that our reading list should be eclectic. And it sometimes surprises me that people who read nonfiction, they say, well, I read important stuff. I read history. I read politics. I read about economy. I don't have time for fiction. Or sometimes people who are very fond of fiction do not read nonfiction. And I find that a bit problematic because I think curiosity is endless and curiosity knows no boundaries. That's the beauty of it. So to me, it's much more interesting and intellectually, if not spiritually, challenging when we read across disciplines, across cultures, East and West, fiction and non-fiction. And to be honest, there's a question I ask myself: how is it possible that so many experts got so many things wrong again and again and again? The Euro crisis happened, the financial crisis happened, Brexit happened, Trump happened, lots of things happened. And people who know their fields very well did not see any of these coming. And I think part of the reason is because everybody is so atomized. We know our own field well, but if you don't know what's happening next door, then you cannot connect the dots. And we're living in a world of interconnectivity when the main thing is how to connect the dots. I mean, we might have a lot of knowledge about technology, but if you don't know what's happening in the Middle East politically today, that big vacuum is going to affect your predictions. So I guess all I'm trying to say is I think we need more interdisciplinary work and people talking to each other across disciplines, learning from each other across disciplines. That to me is much more interesting and seems like a healthier approach, especially for today's world.
I want to take you backwards to your early years. Reading about your grandmother was just magnificent. And you say she didn't watch the news, she didn't read the newspapers, she read coffee grounds instead. My grandmother's house was filled with superstitions, magic and chaos. The stories she would tell were part of an oral culture that had been handed from one generation to the next. I want you to talk a little bit about that, and also to talk about your interest in that guise for mysticism.
Yes, I think part of the answer is about movements. I've lived a nomadic life, if I may put it this way, because I was born in Strasbourg in France to Turkish parents, and the first house that I was brought into was full of immigrants, leftist students. For them, I think revolution was not a noun; it was a verb. It was a way of life, And this was a house in which there was a lot of tobacco smoke, gauloise, people smoking, talking about revolution, reading.
Gauloise without filter, I imagine.
Exactly, the strong one.
Sans filtre.
Sans filtre. Reading Althusser, reading Jean-Paul Sartre, but not so much Simone de Beauvoir, And so that was the environment. And then afterwards, my parents got separated. My father stayed in Strasbourg, but my mother brought me to Turkey, to her motherland. Whereas for me, Turkey was a new country to discover. And we came to my grandmother's house in Ankara, in the capital, into a very conservative neighborhood we have arrived. And this was a very patriarchal setting, I have to say. And from that moment onwards, I was raised by these two women who were incredibly different from one another. My mom is very, well-educated, secular, westernized, modern, rational, urban. And I think grandma would tick all the opposite boxes. More Eastern, definitely more irrational, and very superstitious.
But wise.
But she was exactly. She was incredibly wise in her own way. And also, I think this is something that I appreciated more and more over the years. She was a very compassionate person. Kindness. She's the one who taught me the importance of kindness. And I think we should never lose sight of that. So that left an impact on me. The very fact that I didn't grow up in a typical family, if I may put it this way, the fact that I was raised by two very different women who supported each other, so who believed, that's why maybe I believe in sisterhood, because I've seen how my grandmother supported my mother's independence. And when she did that, the impact of that kind of support and sisterhood went beyond generations. It also changed my life and probably my children's life. So I'm a big believer in women empowering women.
We started this conversation with yet another passion, which is Walter Benjamin, and Hannah Arendt, in a very famous essay that introduced the American-speaking public, the English-speaking public, to Benjamin's work, a collection called Illuminations, says that Benjamin describes him as a failed mystic. And I'm really wondering, I mean, there's so much debate about that, and who owns Benjamin is a big question. We can't go into it now, but hopefully when this quarantine is over, Elif, you and I can debate this at some length. But in the meantime, would you agree with that assessment?
I love that description, a failed mystic. It resonates with me deeply. And Benjamin is I think is a remarkable mind, a remarkable human being. Definitely, he's someone who's left a huge impact on me. And if you approach him from the point of view of, for instance, Gershom Scholem, he would say, "Well, you're such a good mystic. What are you doing over there amongst those leftists and liberals, right?
Why don't you come to Jerusalem? Come.
Why?
And and Elif, I've always been amazed in that correspondence. Scholem writes to Benjamin. Benjamin gets a letter saying, come to Jerusalem. 2, 3, 4, 5 months go by before he answers. He resists what could have saved him.
Oh, definitely. I mean, absolutely. At the same time, I'm thinking, maybe I'm reading it also in a more metaphorical way. When he says, "Come over here," I'm thinking maybe there's a second meaning to it. Like, what are you doing next to those leftist thinkers? Come over here, because you're such a good mystic from Scholem's point of view. But then you can also approach Benjamin through the eyes of Bertolt Brecht. And then Brecht would say, again, in his letters, "You're such a good leftist or liberal or progressive-minded thinker. What are you doing among those mystics? Or why are you involved in mysticism? Come over here."
Poor Walter.
And the interesting thing about Benjamin is he's neither here nor there. He has his own path. He's a mixture of these seeming contrasts, maybe a mixture of faith and doubt. And that's why he's a failed mystic.
I love that. Faith and doubt brings to mind the wonderful, wonderful line of Buñuel, who says, "I have always been on the side of those who seek truth, but I will part with them when they think they have found it."
Oh, it's beautiful. That's so true.
And really, in a way, it speaks so strongly against all fundamentalisms.
Absolutely. And absolutely. I mean, and I think we need to remember this more and more. There's nothing more scary than this certainty and the arrogance that comes with certainty. I think doubt is beautiful. And faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are incredibly dangerous.
In this context, yet again, Gramsci comes to mind, and your interest in that one line that I so much love, and I suppose everybody who comes into contact with Gramsci does, where he says, "Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will." I'm wondering, in the present context of this global pandemic, how Gramsci is to be interpreted for you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think particularly that line, that quote from Gramsci, in a way should be the motto of our times. Because when the mind is not a pessimist, what we end up with is maybe we become a bit too complacent, which is exactly what happened in early 2000s. You will remember there was a time when there was so much certainty, confidence, and optimism, if you will, that the world was going forward, that the Soviet Union was no more, the Berlin Wall had collapsed, that the only viable option was liberal democracy, and history from now on could only go forward. And thanks to digital technologies, we were all going to become one big global village. Nationalism was going to lose its power. Religion was going to lose its importance, and it was going to become just more freedom of speech, more human rights everywhere. And countries that were lagging behind were going to catch up with the rest of the developed world sooner or later. And again, there was so much optimism back then. You might remember when Arab Spring started, people thought Facebook was going to bring democracy to the Middle East. So much so that a young Egyptian couple named their newborn baby daughter Facebook. Goodness. With that kind of optimism. And I never forget, within that year, a family in Israel, they named their third child Like. And fast forward, I think about those kids a lot today, Facebook in Egypt and Like in Israel. How is their life like today?
Will they meet?
Yeah.
Will
they meet?
Will Facebook and Like get together and marry?
Wouldn't that be amazing? Across cultures.
Yeah, across Egypt and Israel.
I would love that.
It's wild. In closing, Elif, we began with Miloš. Let's end with him. Let's end with this very short passage from his poem written in 1945 called Dedication, where he says, "What is poetry which does not save nations or people? A connivance with official lies." I'm wondering how that speaks to you.
Oh, beautiful. I think, again, it comes back to, in a way, what Gramsci was saying. We do know that we cannot change as much as we want to, but we cannot give up trying.
Right.
So in a way, even as our minds remain a bit more of a pessimist, our heart, our will needs to remain an optimist. And I think that kind of optimism that we need will come from our fellow human beings, if and when we manage to connect across borders.
Elif, can I thank you enough? Well, I can say thank you. And I'm wondering, do you think this pandemic is going to bring about a change, or are we going to go back to what, as my mother used to say, passes for normal?
I think lots of things are going to change, but we are at the crossroads. My feeling is, in a way, nothing is going to be the same anymore. And we're going to see some short-term consequences, for sure, but also long-term effects. And I believe this is an age in which we honestly, urgently need to talk about inequality, discrepancies, gaps that keep us apart from each other as human beings. This is not a side issue anymore. So lots of things need to be restructured. We need an honest rethinking about our political, economic, and social structures, but also definitely our health services. Where do we invest? What is our priority in life? So I believe we need to go through a lot of questioning from now on.
Elif, I thank you so much. Let's leave the questions wide open and hope that those who have the power to change matters will do so in a beneficial way. We hope. Elif, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. More next time we'll talk about Sioran, and we'll talk about so many other people who matter to us. In the meantime, I give you a virtual hug.
I give you a hug as well. It's been such a pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for being part of the Quarantine Tapes.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Bye-bye. Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.